Somewhere between history and rumor, between science and sorcery, there exists a story that refuses to stay buried. In the shadowed courts of emperors, in the notebooks of philosophers, and in the margins of revolutions, a name continues to appear, then disappear, the Rosicrucians. But were they mystics, rebels, or a fiction so powerful that it became real? Let's explore when the invisible leaves a very visible trace, here on Things Visible and Invisible. Ronnie Pontiac worked as Manly P. Hall's research assistant, screener, and designated substitute lecturer for 7 years. He is also a producer of award-winning documentaries and an author of a number of titles, including The Rosicrucian Counterculture, The Origins and Influence of the Invisible Society. And he joins me down the line from his home in Los Angeles. Ronnie, welcome to Things Visible and Invisible.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, Ronnie, I think we better start at the beginning. Rosicrucians, it sounds like a disease, but but your research would seem to suggest that its influence and its lineage are something we need to pay attention to.
Indeed. So let me give you a little bit of background. The year was 1600. The Catholic Church, which had dominated Europe for centuries, had suffered a setback when Luther nailed his observations about Catholic, let's call it hypocrisy, onto the church door. And Northern Europe and parts of England and Western Europe had become Protestant. The church was busily trying to figure out how to reclaim them. And as a demonstration of how serious they were about this, in 1600, a fellow by the name of Giordano Bruno, who was brilliant and who believed that the earth actually went around the sun instead of the other way around, and who believed that ancient Egypt had an influence on the wisdom tradition of the West, and who believed in reincarnation, was burned at the stake as an example to others. Also, a bookseller who had managed to find a copy of Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy for a customer was discovered and was executed by being thrown into a river. So the church had made it very clear that they were not going to be tolerant of any kind of heresies. In the meantime, in the heavens, there was this tremendous amount of action. There was a comet. There was the great conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, which was thought to be the star of Jesus. There was a supernova in the sky, so something new appeared. And this was during the birth of what would become astronomy, which in the beginning was very mixed up with astrology. So there were all kinds of prophecies and predictions. On the Catholic side, of course, the idea was that the Protestants were about to fail. The Catholic Church would reestablish control over Europe. Among the Protestants, the prophecies were that the Catholic Church would fail, that this would be the last pope, and that there would be a great liberation from the Holy Roman Empire, which was the military arm of the Vatican. So we had this setting really for the 30 Years' War, which would start not too long later. So in the midst of this, something happened that created this horrendous controversy. It was the release of a little manifesto, this little book, which I was lucky enough to hold in my hands in Manly Hall's library. And it wasn't even intended to be published. It was something that had been written in manuscript. And what it was, no one was exactly sure. It claimed to be the announcement of this new society that was called the Rosicrucians. And they were founded by a monk named Father CRC. It's been described as the first science fiction, as magical realism. It's a strange combination of radical politics, religious, revolutionary sentiments, and it's quite in distinction to what was going on in the churches at that time. So, for example, there was a general distrust of science. Science was considered dangerous. It was satanic. As it says in the Bible, too much knowledge puffeth up. But the Rosicrucians believed that science was the future of humanity, that there was wisdom was all over the nature, and that nature held secrets that would improve human life, that would heal disease, that would make it possible to create a utopia. And so they encouraged science. They also believed in freedom of knowledge. One of the major differences in these manifestos was that in both the Protestant and Catholic worlds, knowledge was hierarchical. In other words, you couldn't just be some fellow who was interested in these subjects and then find them and study them. You would have to earn that by working your way up through different levels in the church. And the utmost knowledge was only held at the top levels. Only those people had access to all the hidden knowledge, the secret knowledge. But among the Rosicrucians, the idea was that knowledge should be available to everyone. They came up with the idea of what they call the invisible college, which is everywhere and nowhere. Sounds a little bit like what the internet was intended to be. They talked about a book M, which might have stood for Mundi, the world, a book that would have all the knowledge in the world. And ultimately, they wanted to see everyone educated, women, indigenous people. They wanted the creation of a language that everybody could speak so that everyone could communicate. And these were radical, crazy ideas at that time. And that's why they only had them in manuscript. The manuscripts, which originated around Bohemia or southern Germany, got all the way to Scotland. And we see little signs of them in the early 1600s. But around 1614, a fellow by the name of Moritz the Learned, a nobleman in Bohemia, got the idea that this was great propaganda and that he would put it out there both to get attention for his kingdom, but also in order to hopefully start a conflict where he thought the Protestants would probably win, and then he would gain advantage from this. And without asking permission from the authors, who were anonymous, he simply published this thing. And the first manifesto, which was called the Fama, was a huge success in a way. It created this massive controversy, and hundreds of books and pamphlets were published against it, for it, and for the most part, completely misunderstanding it.
Now, you've set it out wonderfully there, Ronnie, in terms of its historical basis. I'm just thinking of the influences that bring us to that point. We're talking approximately 100 years after Luther, when the idea of more free-flowing religious thought perhaps was current, certainly in Europe. But we're also talking of a time when there was a kind of, partly because of the Reformation, a rebirth and a desire for, shall we say, occult knowledge of some sort. I'm thinking of, for example, the rise of the Freemasons around about the same time. Was there any linkage between that? Do you see in your researches a sort of wider, free-thinking, slightly mystical, slightly occult element that had crept into European intellectual society?
Yes, I think that we've been told often that Freemasonry emerged from Rosicrucianism as if the Rosicrucians had somehow planned it. But that doesn't seem to be the case. I think that it did inspire Freemasonry. We can see a big difference in the way that Freemasonry is hierarchical. One must rise through the differing degrees. It is not the Rosicrucian idea of free knowledge that circulates more in terms of who asks the right questions, who has the enthusiasm for knowledge. Instead, there is this need to follow the strict rules and to go step by step, which may be a good thing. Now, in the past, the idea was that the Rosicrucians were some kind of like amazing group of superhuman monks who had found knowledge. CRC was said to have traveled in the East and to have been enlightened by the sages there. He tried to bring the knowledge back to Europe, but the Europeans laughed at him. So he gathered up just a few brothers, and they created this so-called invisible society. People took it very literally. There was even a panic in France once when some smartass put up posters saying the Rosicrucians are in town and we're looking for people, but don't contact us, we'll contact you. They thought that they had the power of invisibility literally, but they were an invisible society because they didn't want to wind up like Giordano Bruno at the stake. So the real situation seems to be based on the most recent academic research, because in the late 20th century and beginning of the 21st century, academia finally woke up to the idea that these areas were worth studying. And archives were opened that had never been opened before. And prior to that, authors like Manly Hall, Madame Blavatsky were doing the best they could, but they didn't really have access to very important information. And so, especially under Blavatsky's influence, the idea became very au courant that the Rosicrucians were hidden masters, ascended masters, people with literally superpowers because they had enlightened themselves and evolved past human limitations. But when we start to look at these new historical surveys, what we find is it looks like it was a group of college kids influenced by radical professors who were reading people like Bruno, who were influenced by Marsilio Ficino, who was sometimes called the father of the Florentine Renaissance, who translated the Platonists and the Neoplatonists and the Orphic hymns and the Hermetic writings, and who was one of those who early on theorized that there was this chain of knowledge that originated in Egypt, came through Greece and then through Rome and through the troubadours and so on. So there was an enthusiasm, again, very different from the church, where one type of Christianity would get you, potentially burned at the stake because it wasn't the right kind of Christianity. Here, they were embracing what they thought was Egyptian knowledge, Greek knowledge, pagan knowledge. They thought that there was amazing wisdom there that foreshadowed the teachings of Christ. And there's one other thing here that's very interesting, which is, today we're really facing this surveillance culture, and it's this pervasive effort to control all information and to basically spy on all of us. The Catholic Church had that in place for centuries through the confessional, because in the confessional, which you avoided at peril of your soul burning eternally, you would be telling the priest information. And if you happen to work for an important official, or you happen to be near someone who was involved in a conspiracy of some kind, you would be telling your priest about it. And the priest was actually legally bound to tell that information if it was potentially important to the Vatican, to his superior. And it could go all the way up to the Pope. So this was an amazing system of surveillance where they were getting this constant information from every strata of society. And in a way, in declaring its invisibility, the Rosicrucians were attempting to bypass this and to exist in a kind of secrecy that however, caused a lot of misunderstandings about who they were, what they were. So, for example, a lot of people thought the manifestos represented this, what the Rosicrucians called a universal reformation, that these people knew how to make this happen. Really, what they were trying to say was, if you want a universal reformation, you've got to start with yourself. And then you become an example to your family, to your community, and from there, a universal reformation could occur. But most of the people writing in support of the Rosicrucians were saying, hey, I want to be part of this. I believe that I have the knowledge that should make me one of you. And when, of course, they weren't contacted by anyone, they got angry. And some of them wrote books and pamphlets then denouncing the Rosicrucians as a fraud. But let me give you an example of this misinterpretation aside from invisibility. So there's this very interesting statement in the second Rosicrucian manifesto. There were three. They were published one year after the other, 1614, 1615, and then 1616. In the Confessio of 1615, there's this statement. It says, if it wasn't sufficient enough to live without fearing hunger, poverty, disease, or age, wouldn't it be an excellent thing to live always as if you'd lived from the beginning of the world and you would live to the end of the world? And you would live in one place, but you would know what was happening at the Ganges, and you would know what was happening in Peru, and no one could keep anything secret from you. Well, first of all, it sounds a little bit like the Pope, but this was actually a description of a state of consciousness, which would later be known as cosmic consciousness, and which is described in almost all religious traditions, whether it's the Secret of the Golden Flower, an ancient Chinese Taoist alchemical text, or in spiritualist texts of the 1940s, like the Unobstructed Universe teachings. It's the idea that we have this limited consciousness because we are inhabiting a body, our brain and our senses and our experiences of life limit us, but that our true core is a consciousness that exists outside time and outside space. So it is not subject to those laws, and it exists from the beginning of creation to the end of creation and has access to everything and all knowledge. So that statement was really a mystical description of a state of consciousness, but it was taken literally, that they were free of all diseases, that they could travel to the Ganges or to Peru if they wished to, and they became almost like the first superheroes.
Yes. So, I mean, I think that's very interesting, Ronnie, in terms of their manifesto. But like a lot of invisible societies that there have been in one form or another down through the ages, sometimes the invisibility is simply because people can't quite sort of draw a line around it. Is that what we're talking about with the Rosicrucians? That their manifesto, or they're a loose assembly of individuals, maybe with different ideas, maybe even competing ideas, and that this was a title that was sort of a shorthand, if you like, for people to understand that this is what we're dealing with. Or was there any sense in your researches, if you come across any sense where there was a structure to this other than a sort of a loose collection of ideas that people would subscribe or not to?
That's a very good question. It's interesting because there is a kind of structure described, especially in the first two manifestos. The organization is described. CRC's tomb is a mathematical equation involving Pythagorean mystical ideas about the meanings of numbers and of geometry. And it gives you the impression that this is an organized society. But it's very interesting because one of the people that is probably most likely to have been the author, if not among the authors of the manifestos, Johann Valentin André, who was about 18 or 19 when the first one was written. He had this moment where a fellow by the name of Comenius, who was a great philosopher of education, who was very influenced by Rosicrucian ideas, when he saw all this hubbub about the Rosicrucians, he was smart enough to realize that he thought André might be behind it. So he wrote a letter to André and he said, I'm very interested in the Rosicrucians and in the ideas of the Rosicrucians, and I believe that you may be at the center of this, and I would like to join your society. André wrote him back, and he said, it's not really a society, it's just a group of friends. And he described it as a ludibrium, a Latin word that means it could be a hoax or a practical joke. So it could be understood as a literary hoax, as something that was written to create the idea of this society. But then as it evolved over time, and this is so fascinating to me, not only did it give birth and inspire huge movements like Freemasonry, but it also morphed into unrecognizable variations. So for example, in England, Cromwell was influenced by the Rosicrucians. And he had a similar idea of utopia that he was striving for. And his favorite poet, Milton, was also influenced by the Rosicrucians. And so Cromwell had this idea that he had to kill a whole bunch of people to get to this utopia, which was absolutely not what the Rosicrucians were about. And of course, Cromwell was also very committed to hierarchies, which is something, again, the Rosicrucians were more anarchic in that sense. They liked freedom of information. They thought that freedom should travel horizontally, not vertically. And then a little bit further down the line, you get this group called the Golden and Rosy Cross. And amongst them were a couple of fellows who became the power behind one of the thrones in Europe. And they were almost as bad as the Vatican. They were practicing censorship and strict control over the society and manipulation to such a degree that I think that they may be where the idea that the Rosicrucians are these elitist Illuminati that have been behind all the terrible things that have happened in Western society for centuries may have come from. So it turned into things that did not resemble what the people who invented it intended.
I mean, I'm wondering as well, because you've touched on a number of different facets of society. Are we talking about a group who have a political agenda, a societal agenda, or is it something which veers into the mystical? What's your take on that, Ronnie? Where do you think that what we can discern as Rosicrucians and the manifesto, where was it taking both its devotees but also society in general?
Another great question. All of it. That's part of what made it so revolutionary. They were mystical, as in that paragraph that I quoted to you. They also were political. For instance, in the Confessio, they talk about how they think Islam and the Holy Roman Empire and the Pope are evil. They're vipers. They want to see the Pope scratched to death by nails, which I think refers to Luther's nails, but it's still quite an image. And they want the Pope to be the last Pope. They want to see the end of the Vatican because they believe that the Vatican is actually not involved with what Jesus intended at all. And they are political because they understand that this should occur through politics. So in the beginning, I think when the enthusiasm for this idea really originated, there was a Holy Roman Emperor named Rudolf II. And Rudolf was really into the occult. And he was really not into Christianity. And so he had actually moved the capital of the Holy Roman Empire to Prague. And he did something very radical there. He issued an edict of religious freedom because he was interested. He, for instance, would talk to the rabbis in Prague about the Kabbalah. He wanted to know what Islam thought through the Sufis. He wanted to know the whole history of mysticism and magic. And he kept at his court a huge room full of alchemists trying to make the universal medicine, trying to make gold. He also had a room filled with painters. And so he really had this idea of encouraging human creativity and not controlling it with strict ideas about what was heresy and what wasn't. And they thought, the Rosicrucians and many other people, that if he would just declare himself the Hermetic emperor, if he would declare to everyone that he was interested in the occult as well as the sciences, and his court is where things like telescopes were developed and the beginnings of astronomy and of chemistry, that if that happened and he stood against the Pope, that there was a hope that some kind of a cultural union and rebirth could occur. But really, Rudolf had no interest in taking that kind of position. He hated bureaucracy. He simply wanted to be allowed to follow his interests. And that was very disappointing to everyone, including the Pope, who eventually deposed him in favor of his younger brother, who immediately ripped up the Edict of Religious Freedom. But interestingly, people who are influenced by the Rosicrucians, for instance, like Comenius's assistant, became involved in the British colonies in the very earliest days of America around, this was Sir Walter Raleigh's work. And the treasurer of those colonies, of the business that created them, was Comenius's assistant, who had been deeply influenced by the Rosicrucians, just like Comenius. And one of the things that was instantly talked about was this religious freedom. Now, this was because they were trying to protect their own religious freedom. And yet it was a continuation of this idea that Rudolf had that was really something that was precious to the Rosicrucians.
Now, you've mentioned the word Illuminati, Ronnie, and I'm sure that is something which, again, people who know very little about Rosicrucians will sort of link it to, as you've alluded to, the idea of an invisible society. Often in people's imagination means that then they are a power behind the throne. They're working in nefarious ways in some way or other. Is that what we're dealing with here, or are we talking about people who are more interested in debating ideas rather than actually getting their hands on the levers of power?
Yes, that's another good question. I think that, as I said, there were moments when Rosicrucian turned into things like these fellows in the Golden and Rosy Cross who really have the whiff of that definition of Illuminati about them. But certainly the people who wrote the manifestos did not have any idea of that. They were egalitarian, and they were not people who wanted to create an order that they could control. They wanted to liberate knowledge. They wanted to lift everybody with them. And I think that it's very interesting to me because having known, for example, Manly Hall, and Manly Hall is now these days often accused of having been an Illuminati or a reptilian or all the kinds of things that are going around. Now, I did not know him early in life. I knew him at the end of his life, but he was the most wholesome, generous, just a lovely human being to be around with no ambitions of any kind along those lines. And so I'm always amazed to hear him described in these terms with such suspicion. But I think that this is a thing that human beings do. We create supernatural reasons to excuse, let's say, our own cruelty. That human beings are the ones who create all the horrors that occur in society. But we say that the devil did it, or the Illuminati did it, or the Gnostic archons did it. And that way we remove the blame from humanity. But I think it's really within us that this, let's call it evil, exists. And you can even look at it scientifically and point out that if you look at the animals that are nearest to us in terms of DNA, chimpanzees, they are capable of horrendous cruelty. And so are we going to surmise that they have Illuminati among them who have destroyed their society and created these hierarchies, or that they have archons or demons who are infesting their minds? It's part of the evolution of biological creatures, I think. And so I think that we project into the Rosicrucians or into Manly Hall this idea that they have some sort of a supernatural power that we can then blame for what's going on in society that alarms us. Now we can see in what's happening in America with the Epstein case that there are secret groups of people who exercise all kinds of terrible things when they have the power to do so. But in my opinion, there isn't a secret religion behind it, even if they decide to do some sort of ritualism, because that appeals to them in terms of the drama of showing their power. That this is not originating from a supernatural cause. This is human beings behaving badly. And the Rosicrucians in the beginning, the people who created these manifestos, were very concerned with the well-being of human beings, with increasing knowledge, with liberating human beings, and not just men, but women and indigenous people, and bringing back what they call the knowledge of Adam, the secret language of Adam, the ability to truly understand the wisdom of creation that was put there by the divine.
Now, I'm wondering in your researches, Ronnie, whether you see a sort of lineage from the people you've talked about, the manifesto, with in the next century, the sort of philosophical movements that developed, especially on the continent, in Germany and in France. Do you see the influence of these ideas permeating through to philosophical systems which are very much mainstream today?
Yes, absolutely. I see. It's funny because it goes both ways. So within a generation, for example, in England, there's a character in comedy who's called the Rosicrucian, who is an old man usually, who doesn't know what's going on around him, who has his nose in books all the time and is utterly clueless, but thinks he understands the secrets of the universe. But at the same time, there was this movement toward science that the Rosicrucians were very influential, I think, in. So Descartes, for example, was so influenced by the Rosicrucians that he went looking for Rosicrucians and famously had a dream, which in some sense was the beginning of science. And then we can see in the character of someone named John Winthrop the Younger, who came from England to the Boston colony. His father was the governor of Boston colony. And John the Younger was somebody who had also gone looking for Rosicrucians, couldn't find any, but decided to apply Rosicrucian ideals in his life. So in America, he became the founding force of the Connecticut territory. And there he did not only alchemical experiments, and he was the alchemical doctor for at least half of the territory, and a famous doctor at that. He was very effective. But he also found really improved methods of desalination, methods of iron ore extraction and processing. He was always looking for ways to improve what we would call science, and was trying to collect a group of people that would be called the College of Light. This was Comenius's idea. He wanted to bring the greatest minds from around the world to Connecticut to create this college where they could all work together to discover the secrets of nature and to improve human life. And this influenced the creation of the Royal Society. So you could say that the Rosicrucians, in fact, some of the people that were involved in the creation of the Royal Society were people who had been inspired by Rosicrucian ideas.
Fascinating. Now, if we move a little bit further, obviously we have the occult revival of the late 19th century on both sides of the Atlantic and elsewhere. How much were Rosicrucian ideas or the image co-opted into that?
It's very well said. The image becomes very important. And you've got Bulwer-Lytton writing about a Rosicrucian, literally the Rosicrucian. You've got Madame Blavatsky talking about the Rosicrucians and comparing them to her invisible masters, her ascended masters. You have somebody like Paschal Beverly Randolph in America, who was a man of color and who started out as a spiritualist. And when he was telling his ideas to people, no one was listening to him, and he felt this was because of his color. He traveled to Europe, and when he came back, he said that he'd been initiated by the Rosicrucians, and he started to talk about and write about the same ideas, and suddenly everyone was interested. Later, he would confess in a book that he never met any Rosicrucians, that he simply said that in order to be taken seriously. And there were others who invented orders. Sometimes they would simply declare that this was an ancient order, even though it wasn't. And other times, for instance, in France, there was a wonderful order that was called the Salon de la Rose-Croix, Paladin's group, which really encouraged art. And so Satie was a member of that group. Debussy was a member of that group. And a lot of what became Impressionism in music and in art was inspired. A lot of symbolism came from that group. And then, of course, in Freemasonry, they in the Scottish Rite, they began to have a Rosicrucian degree. And you were being taught Rosicrucian ideas in places by people like Pike, who were important in organizing the wisdom that the Masons would study.
And then into America, into Los Angeles, Manly P. Hall. What was his take on the whole Rosicrucian counter-revolution?
It's very interesting because in the very beginning, when he was starting out, he was helped greatly by Max Heindel's widow. And Max Heindel was one of the founders of a public Rosicrucian order. You used to see in the backs of magazines, there were these little ads that would say, "Become a Rosicrucian, learn the secrets of nature." And if you wrote, they would sign you up for a very inexpensive sequence of lessons, like monthly lessons, that would teach you the basics of Western esotericism, astrology, Kabbalah, ideas about alchemy and such. And Madame Heindel saw in Manly Hall something really dramatic, that he had charisma, he was very wise. For someone his age, he had tremendous knowledge. And so she encouraged him. She taught him, for example, how to cast astrological charts. She taught him how to self-publish. And she opened up for him the archives that her husband, Max, had acquired for the Rosicrucian Fellowship on the West Coast. And so he was deeply influenced by this. And through his grandmother, he was deeply influenced by Madame Blavatsky. And in the early days, he followed Blavatsky in somewhat glamorizing the idea of Rosicrucians as hidden masters, as initiates. And I talked to him about this. I suffered what my wife Tamara called initiate fever as a result of this, which is that I wanted to be an initiate. I wanted to join these people. So I had started to do these kind of prohibitions about behavior and these vows, trying to be worthy of it. And it really messed up my life. I got involved in situations that were detrimental to me. And when I approached Manly Hall about it and explained it, I'll never forget, he and his wife Marie were in this dark room. There was lightning. It was so dramatic. And so the lightning was lightening it up. And they were laughing at me. I mean, in a good humored, affectionate kind of way, but they were just like, oh my God, you poor fool, you know? And he said to me, no, you missed the whole point. These are metaphors. And later we talked about it more in depth. I asked him, if you had anything to change as you look back on your life, what would you change? And he said that he wouldn't have glamorized the idea of initiates. He wouldn't have glamorized the Rosicrucians as he did. That instead he'd come to believe that the Rosicrucians were really, it was just an adjective or a noun for the best people in any given time, that people who were really devoted to improving human life and improving society could be called Rosicrucians. But they were just people. They were not superhuman people.
And today, Ronnie, do we have, we must have sort of neo-Rosicrucians who are formalized in one way or another?
Yeah, the societies continue to exist, including the fellowship, the Rosicrucian Fellowship, and they continue to be functioning orders that teach people the Western esoteric tradition. Also, we have Steiner's group, Rudolf Steiner's group in Germany, which is spread across the world and which claimed Rosicrucian origins and inspiration. And it's a little bit in the Blavatsky tradition, but it also serves as a way for people to enter into Western esotericism and to learn this rich history of alternative knowledge that has really been there all along. For instance, in America, as I wrote about in my book, American Metaphysical Religion, it has been characterized as being fringe, but in reality, this was something that was there from the very beginning and has been very influential. There's always been people in America who were interested in the Rosicrucians and the Kabbalah and astrology, and we find them in very high up places, not just Freemasons. For instance, the Pilgrims, who we think of or are taught here at least that they were just strictly Christian, and this was a strictly Christian country. If you go into the academic studies, there was a book published in 1979, rather an article by a guy named John Butler, who said that he found evidence that only about 1 out of 3 Americans in the 1600s attended church at all in America. And that was a high number up in Maine and New England. In the South, it was even fewer. And there were complaints by priests and by also governors that they couldn't get people into the churches, that people were acting more like indigenous people, superstitions they called it, than they were practicing established denominations. And so you had, for instance, at Yale, a president of the college who loved Kabbalah and who convened the other university presidents and told them that they should be teaching Kabbalah at all the colleges in America. And among the Pilgrims, through John Winthrop the Younger, we see that in the house of the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, there's a guy practicing alchemy and astrology. And when he dies, he is eulogized by Cotton Mather as Hermes Christianus, the Christian Hermes, that's not a very Christian statement. Hermes was a pagan alchemical sage. And then even further, Mather said, these matters are okay for people like me to study, but farmers and regular people shouldn't study them. So even the Pilgrims were influenced and deeply interested in the Western esoteric tradition.
And I suppose leading on from that, Ronnie, I mean, if we take it that Freemasonry and Freemasons have played a very important part in the creation of the United States and subsequently to that. You just have to look at a list of presidents who have been Freemasons, for example. Do you see through your researches also the fingerprints of the Rosicrucian counterculture in the establishment and creation and continuation of the United States of America?
Yes, especially through the Freemasons. In the early days, it's a very direct influence, as I've mentioned, Walter Raleigh, John Winthrop the Younger, and others. For instance, there were people with Rosicrucian ideas fighting the witch panic in New England in the early days and defending people who were accused of being witches. Later, it becomes more organized through Freemasonry. And it also, though, I would mention its influence in the arts worldwide. So, for example, you see in the work of Borges or in the work of Pessoa, these fantastic writers, that they are deeply influenced by the existence and the ideas of the Rosicrucians. And I think in America in particular, there's this kind of a Rosicrucian heritage that's waiting to be discovered. It was very ironic for me. It is ironic for me to be talking about this book right now, because the Rosicrucians were fighting the same battle that's being fought in America right now against what calls itself Christian nationalism. And a lot of Christian nationalism is connected to Opus Dei, which is a kind of Catholic, I would say fringe, but very powerful society that is trying to reinstitute Catholic control over society. And this is exactly what the Rosicrucians were fighting. And this is what the people who established America were fighting as well. So there's this kind of heritage of Rosicrucian ideas, such as freedom of religion, such as the glory of knowledge and science, the importance of the freedom and education of women and of indigenous people and people of color, that is obviously at the heart of what America is trying to become. But there's still this kind of remnant of these early European medieval ideas about the need to have the Catholic Church controlling everything and the elite kind of hierarchical structure that makes that possible. And the Rosicrucians were devoted to the end of that hierarchical structure and to the freedom of knowledge, to make knowledge universally available, because the idea was that you never knew where you were going to find a genius. So by allowing people, all kinds of people, whatever gender or race or religious belief, to have full access to knowledge and to be able to, through merit, achieve a place in the world, you would vastly improve society instead of putting that control in the hands of an elite with a very limited idea of what's allowed and what isn't allowed.
Come to the end of our time together. Tell people where they can find out more about you and where they can pick up a copy of your book.
Oh, thank you. You can find the Rosicrucian Counterculture pretty much anywhere online, and it can be ordered from most bookshops. It is available at Watkins in London. And also you can find me on my Substack, on Instagram, on Facebook, and on Medium. And I do answer questions. You're welcome to reach out to me.
For now, Ronnie, thank you so much for coming on Things Visible and Invisible.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of Things Visible and Invisible. We're dedicated to uncovering phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality, from ancient enigmas and paranormal encounters to scientific anomalies and forgotten histories. If you enjoyed this journey into the mysterious and unexplained, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell to stay updated on future explorations. Have a personal experience or story that aligns with our investigations? We'd love to hear from you. Visit our website at tvi.show and reach out through our contact form. While we can't feature every submission, we review them all, and your story might be featured in an upcoming episode. To support our continued investigations, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter or channel member. Your contributions make these explorations possible and give you access to exclusive content, early releases, and monthly behind-the-scenes discussions with our team. Don't forget to check out our merch store. We've got everything from TVI-branded t-shirts and hoodies to stickers and coffee mugs, perfect for showing your support while keeping the mysteries close. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time as we continue to explore the things visible and invisible.